Hello, Star Wars fans. Welcome to my Star Wars book review for May 2017, being brought to you in June 2017. Due to technical difficulties, this video had to be pushed back a few days, but I'm all ready now. Everything is fixed, and I can finally give you guys my review. For those of you who don't remember, my last review was of Timothy Zahn's highly celebrated Thrawn Trilogy, which is considered by many, including myself, to be one of the best and one of the most important pieces of Star Wars media outside of the movies. It was the thing that really jump-started the expanded universe, what is now known as the Legends timeline. But once Disney came along, bought Star Wars, and officially deemed the EU as no longer canon, and pretty much started with a blank slate outside of the movies and the TV shows, they obviously had full range to fill in the blanks themselves with brand new stories and brand new characters. And I thought today it would be good to review the books that pretty much take the place of the Thrawn Trilogy, not in terms of content, but more in their placement in the timeline, as the purpose of these books is to fill the blanks of what happened after Return of the Jedi, and more specifically meant to bridge the gap between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. And that would be these books, the Aftermath Trilogy by Chuck Wendig. I'm not overly familiar with Mr. Wendig's work outside of these three books, but this is basically the new trilogy to answer all the questions that we had back in the day. What happened after Return of the Jedi? What happened after the second Death Star blew up? What happened after Darth Vader and the Emperor were killed off? And these three books right here help fill some of that gap, answer some of those questions, although done in a much different way from the way the Thrawn Trilogy did it. The Thrawn Trilogy followed the same group of characters that we knew from the movies, and basically continued their stories and their own character developments in ways that made sense. This one, basically, while it does feature original trilogy characters, it has a brand new group of characters that are meant to kind of carry the load throughout the main story of these books. And whether that's better or worse than the Thrawn Trilogy, I'll really leave up to you. I'm open either way. I like new characters. I also like the old characters from the original movies, so, whichever. And right off the bat, I'll say that does keep it from feeling like a carbon copy, or keeps it out of the shadow of the Thrawn Trilogy or any of the Expanded Universe books, to be honest. So that's a good thing right off the bat. It's allowed to stand on its own. But yeah, these three books right here, we got the first book, which is just called Aftermath. Sorry, the light's getting in the way. The second book, which was Aftermath Life Debt. And the one to conclude the trilogy, Empire's End, which actually features as its climax the Battle of Jakku, which really is sets the stage for The Force Awakens and Rey's home, as it turns out. But to get started with these books right off the bat, I'm just going to be super negative just right from the start. I'm going to be super negative. When I typically read a trilogy of Star Wars books, I'll typically read the trilogy straight through. Just as an example, right now I'm currently reading The Bounty Hunter Wars, which is an older piece of the EU, and I'm currently almost done with book 2, and right after I'm done with that, I'm going to read book 3. I read them all in a row, just to get it out of the way, and eventually I'll review it. I did not do that in this case, because the first book was so disorienting and so bad that I was like, I need a break. I can't read these all in a row because I'll go insane. The first book was... It was honestly one of the worst Star Wars books I've ever read. And it has nothing to do with stupid moments or bad characters or annoying characters or anything like that. It has nothing to do with that. I didn't like the way it was structured. And the way all three of these books are set up, you'll have the main story that kind of carries throughout the book, but then there are these interludes that are intercut into the story, showing what else is going on in the galaxy in the fall of the Death Star. In the first book, these interludes come so fast, and the chapters are so short, that I feel like I'm just being hit with a barrage of information, of characters, of different stories going on, to where I completely lost track of what was going on in the main story. I actually had to go back and reread portions of the main story because there were so many interludes, and the chapters were so short that it was just like a barrage. I felt like my brain was being bombarded with information, and it was too fast-paced, and it was too... there was just way too much going on, and I felt like after reading that first book, like this either needed to drop the interludes and just be one straight story all the way through, or it just needed to be like what the Expanded Universe had, the Tales of books, like the Tales of Jabba's Palace, the Tales of the Bounty Hunters, the Tales of Mos Eisley, something like that. Just straight up, alright, here's a bunch of stories of what happened after the second Death Star blew up, and just be a bunch of standalone stories like that. It needed to go either or, but as is, the first book reads like it's a bizarre hybrid of both, and it's very distracting, very disorienting, and one unfortunate problem is that some of the interludes have better ideas for stories than the actual main story. The main story details Nora Wexley, who's was a Y-Wing pilot during the Battle of Endor. And she survived the Battle of Endor, and now that that's over, she's trying to repair her family life with her son, who she's estranged to. And along the way, they ultimately, she makes friends with all these other rebels, and there's an ex-Imperial officer, and there's a bounty hunter, and various other characters. And they ultimately form together it's kind of like Rogue One, if I had to compare it to anything. And it's like these bunch of misfits that are trying to deal with Imperial presence on her home world. And that's really the main story. Unfortunately, like I said, the interludes cut in so fast that the story feels very disjointed. And honestly, I felt like the characters in Part 1 were very bland, to the point where they didn't leave much of an impression. The ex-Imperial that I talked about, I'm trying to remember his name. It was Singer, I believe it was. He is a homosexual character, which is seen as very progressive and everything. However, he failed to leave any kind of an impression on me, outside of the fact that he was gay. And that's typically not a good sign for a character. And I'm not trying to sound homophobic or anything. I'm just saying, yeah, he's gay. What else? Like, you know what I mean? There's not a character there. That's just a trait. That's a character trait. It's not a fully fleshed out character. Fortunately, as the books go along, in books 2 and 3, I felt like his more sarcastic nature comes out more. And it doesn't feel like a stereotypical gay character. He feels more like, if I had to compare him to anything, it's kind of like Wallace from Scott Pilgrim. Just very sarcastic, very dry, and he makes a little bit more of an impression in books 2 and 3, but in the first book, I barely remembered him after it was over. Probably the most memorable character was Nora's son repurposed a Trade Federation battle droid and renamed him Mr. Bones, and turned him into basically like his own personal assassin droid bodyguard, and he's like super, you know, decked out with weapons and very powerful, and yeah, he's memorable just because of what he is, but again, he's kind of the annoying droid character. I get that most Star Wars stories try to have their own droid, like Force Awakens had BB-8. The original trilogy had C-3PO and R2-D2, who were kind of the genesis of that, and you know, I reviewed Death Troopers, and that had Waste. You know, Darth Plagueis had its own central droid character. You know, a lot of these Star Wars stories do try to create their own special droid. Rogue One did it as well. And it makes sense to do that, and I applaud the effort for doing that here. I just thought Bones was kind of such a weird concept. Like, wait, they took a battle droid and made him a super assassin droid. That just feels really strange to me. And all of his text, all of his dialogue is in full caps, which is kind of annoying, and it gives off the impression that the character's just screaming all the time. So that didn't work for me. And going back to what I was saying earlier about the interludes, a lot of the interludes have more interesting stories than what's actually going on in the main story. Just as an example, Han Solo and Chewbacca show up in Part 1. They play a larger role in Part 2, but in Part 1, they're only in one of the interludes. And I was like, oh, cool, Han Solo! And then he doesn't show up again for the rest of the book. So I'm just kind of like, shrugging my shoulders. I'm like, I mean, I'd rather just follow Han Solo and where they're going and what they're doing. Which, to be fair, we do in Part 2. And some of the interludes in Part 1 do come up again in Books 2 and 3. So I guess there was a method to the madness. He was setting up stuff for later on. But there's a Darth Vader cult that springs up. I'd like to see a story about that. I wish that had been the main story, to be perfectly honest. I think that's such an interesting idea and such a cool idea. And you could even use that as kind of like the basis for how Kylo Ren became who he was. And maybe that's going to play into something later on in another book. I don't know. But, yeah, Part 1 was just too disorienting. The main story was kind of dull. And the interludes, while some of them were interesting ideas, it was just, it contributed to a very messy read, and a very unpleasant read, and one that almost made me doubt whether or not I should read Books 2 and 3. Good news, Books 2 and 3 are better. I won't say they're great. They're probably, maybe a little bit north of average, if I had to be honest, but they are better than Book 1, so I will give credit for improvement and fixing some of the problems that were in Book 1. The interludes are still there in Books 2 and 3, but they don't come as frequently. At least it doesn't feel like they do. The chapters themselves are a little bit longer, so I'm able to spend time with the characters, with the story, and it plays a lot better that way. One problem that I do have is that there's a lot of love stories going on. And if you remember my review of the Calista Trilogy, not the biggest fan of love stories. You can do one. You can do a Han and Leia. I'm fine with that. But when that becomes the main focus, it just kind of irritates me. And in Aftermath, there's like Nora, Wedge Antilles actually, and her husband. And there's kind of a love triangle going on there. Sinjit has a lover at one point, and there's like a back and forth between them. The bounty hunter and one of the other rebels in the group, they have a romance going on. Han and Leia come in Part 2, and their romance gets some attention as well. So it's just like a bunch of like relationships and will they, won't they's, and all this other stuff going on. And that's annoying. It's a little annoying, but like I said, Books 2 and 3 are better, and overall provide a better experience, and I don't regret reading them. I will say that, and I do give credit, again, even though I'm kind of trashing on the interludes and the overall format of these books, it does feel different from a lot of other Star Wars books, especially to separate it from the EU, and I think a lot of what was done in these books was done to kind of separate it from the EU, because these are major books that are going to be filling in the blanks left behind by the whitewashing, or not whitewashing, but the clean sweep of the Legends timeline, and just working off that blank slate. I think at the very least there is a solid attempt at trying to be different, and I do appreciate that, but like I said, there's a bunch of problems, and there's also some big gaps in logic as well. Book 2 becomes about the rebels introduced in Book 1 helping Han Solo and Chewbacca liberate Kashyyyk from the Imperials, and some of the sluggishness of the New Republic making decisions and getting the new government on board with that. At first, it opens up with Han Solo leaving Leia, a pregnant Leia, mind you, leaving her to go free Kashyyyk and help out Chewie, which is commendable, but for some bizarre reason, he feels like him and Chewie can liberate Kashyyyk by themselves without, it's like, oh, the Republic won't help us, well, fuck it, we'll just do it anyway, and I'm like, okay, Han Solo, I get that he's got a high opinion of himself, but did he honestly think that he was gonna liberate Kashyyyk by himself? Okay, I don't think that's gonna work out too well for you, buddy. But, yeah. So, like I said, there's some gaps in logic going on. The villains are... I thought, to be honest, I thought the main villain, who feels like a Tarkin-esque character, but there was so much mystery surrounding him, I kind of felt like... Part of my brain was like, is this going to be the setup for... Supreme Leader Snoke? Is he going to be Supreme Leader Snoke? Turns out he's not. Don't mean to give out that spoiler there, but I thought that he was going to be used at least as a foreshadowing to Supreme Leader Snoke. Turns out that that's not the case. So he just kind of feels like a generic military villain. Ray Sloan, who is an Imperial officer who is loyal to the Empire but ultimately breaks away from it by the end of the third book. I feel like if she kind of reminds me of Admiral Dalla from the EU. They're trying to make a strong female Imperial villain or character, and they're trying to give her an imposing presence, but in Dalla's case, part of the problem was she was all bark, no bite. Yes, she was authoritarian, yes, she was in charge, but it felt like she failed all the time, except in Darksaber, where I felt like she was written fairly competently, but if you read the Jedi Academy trilogy, she's kind of I mean, I feel like banana peels are being thrown in front of her all the time, and she just fails all the time. So they're trying to create this strong female character who's kind of like the female version of Grand Admiral Thrawn, and she just leaves no impact because she doesn't accomplish anything. And sure enough, Ray Sloan kind of feels that way too, not to the degree. There are some cool moments like when she's investigating on Coruscant and trying to find out more information about what's going on within the fragmented state of the Empire. Some of that is pretty cool, but she never really raises into like a really impactful level the way Grand Admiral Thrawn did back in the day. There are some nice touches thrown in the book. I like how the New Republic really kind of, again, it's kind of sluggish at first, and they don't really know how to make decisions, and it's like, well, yeah, you overthrew this fascist regime, but Palpatine could just say, all right, send aid over to this planet because whatever, we need them or whatever. If he wanted to, he's such an evil dick, he probably wouldn't, but I'm just saying he could just easily make a decision, and there you go. With here, there's a lot of deliberation, a lot of slowness, a lot of debating and all that other stuff, leading to a lot of inactivity, like Kashyyyk being inhabited by the Empire and them not doing anything about it. One nice touch that I liked, Mas Amedda, who, and I'm sure I butchered the pronunciation there, who was Emperor Palpatine's major domo from the prequel trilogy. You may remember he was the guy in Phantom Menace who was like, "Order! We shall have order!" He was one of the few characters in the prequels that, one of the things that was great about the original trilogy, that you had all these side characters that left an impression and did barely anything. Not many of the prequel side characters did, but I thought he did. And it was all because of his shouting in the Senate chamber, "Order! We shall have order!" And then when it turns out that he's loyal to Palpatine, I was like, wait a minute, seriously? So he was in on all this? I want to know more about that guy. He never really got explored all that much. He pops up every now and then in some books, but he never became like... There's never like a Mas Amedda book or like any kind of an explanation of how he fell into league with Palpatine, or at least none that I've read. And here we get at least finding out, number one, that he's still alive post Return of the Jedi, which is pretty amazing. And he's effectively like the figurehead of the Empire with Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader out of the way. And he is like completely lost. I have no clue what to do. And he's like trying to like act on behalf of the Empire, but he also wants to kind of surrender to the New Republic just to save his skin. And there's some good material with him, and I thought it was very creative to kind of work him into the story. And it's just one of those like unanswered questions from the prequel. It's like, oh yeah, there he is. That guy. I didn't even know he was still alive by this point. That's kind of cool. Other stuff. Like I said, the Battle of Jakku is pretty much the climax of the trilogy. Which is nice that it's an explanation for having that battle. One side note, and I guess this is kind of a knock on The Force Awakens. When they first showed that trailer with the downed Star Destroyer on the desert dune, I was like, man, I pictured the whole galaxy looking like that, Like, the Empire and the Rebellion just kind of destroyed the galaxy, and there is no uniform government. It was just... these are just, two warring factions fighting over land, and this is just kind of the legacy that they left behind. Unfortunately, Force Awakens didn't really play out like that. It was really just, oh, that's only on Jakku, and never mind. So, but yeah, the Battle of Jakku is the climax of the whole story, and overall, it's a satisfying one. It's, it was kind of cool that they worked that in, and again, bridged that gap over to The Force Awakens. And, for a bunch of characters that I really didn't feel anything for in the first book, I did feel at least a little something for them. by the time the third book rolls around. Nora does something incredibly stupid in book 3, but again, one of those lapses in logic. But overall, you know, I liked her okay. Some of the other side characters were okay. There's a bunch of, like, none of these characters are going to go on to be, like, my favorite Star Wars characters or anything like that. But they were okay for the most part. They carried the story adequately. Part of the problem, though, it's kind of a double-edged sword. When they work Han, Leia, and Chewie in Book 2, and I wonder, it's kind of weird, because Luke doesn't really show up. He doesn't show up at all. He gets mentioned a lot, but he doesn't show up. I wonder if there was kind of a mandate by Disney to not use Luke in any kind of major roles in these stories because they want to save it all for The Last Jedi. I don't know. But it feels weird to me that Luke was all over the expanded universe, and now he's like, I don't think of the new canon, I haven't read a single book where Luke is the focus or even really comes in and plays any kind of a role. So that's very interesting. I don't know if that's the case. I'm just speculating. But yeah, when Han, Leia, and Chewie come in, I kind of just want to, like, spend more time with them because I love those characters so much, and everybody else just kind of fades in the background when they're around. And that's unfortunate, and that's the risk you run when you do bring those major characters. It's like, yeah, we're going to pay attention more, but at the same time, you know, the characters that are really supposed to be the main focus of the story kind of fade to the background. And I think that was one of the reasons that not having Luke in The Force Awakens was actually kind of a good thing. It was kind of fortuitous to do it that way. But, because it allowed Finn and Rey more time to shine a little bit, and BB-8 as well. So, yeah, I guess that's overall my impression of the Aftermath trilogy. I hated the first book. Books 2 and 3 are better. Overall, trilogy, kind of average, not... It does, in my mind, it doesn't take the place of the Thrawn trilogy. I mean, I know that's hard to live up to, but, it doesn't come close to matching it. But there are some good elements. After reading books 2 and 3, it's like, okay, I don't regret reading those. And I'm sure probably some people will enjoy those books more than I did. I understand the reactions to these books have been fairly mixed. Some people absolutely hated all 3 of them. Some people actually kind of liked all 3 of them. Again, I guess I'm more middle of the road. Hated the first one. 2 and 3 get better, and there is some good material in there. So, and like I said, I give them credit. Stylistically, it is very differently written from a bunch of other Star Wars books, so it does stand out. So I will give it points for originality in that aspect. But yeah, that concludes the review here. I will have another review for you guys later in the month of June. Probably be coming fairly quick because I'm going to be going to Maine at the end of the month, and I'll be gone for 2 weeks, so I won't really have time to do videos. So I'll probably get that review in right before I leave. So yeah, be on the lookout for that. But that is all I have for now. So peace out, everybody.